Hello, everyone. Welcome to Artwise with Radcliffe Bailey. My name is Nandini Makrandi, and I'm the head curator at the museum. We are so thrilled that you're all here with us tonight. And it's no April Fool's joke. Radcliffe is really here, and we are absolutely thrilled that he can share some of his time and his studio space with us. Before we begin, I want to thank our Artwise sponsor, Martha Mackey. We couldn't do this without her help. And I also want to thank our exhibition sponsors, Wells Fargo and EMJ Construction. Radcliffe's work is currently part of an exhibit we have at the museum called Under Construction Collage from the Mint Museum, which is in Charlotte, North Carolina. Now, the Hunter has a pretty long history with Radcliffe's work. We acquired our piece called In the Returnal in 2007, and it was our first large installation piece. It's a mix of paintings and ephemera, assemblage, tintypes, piano keys, all kinds of things. You'll see an image of it in a few minutes. And it's amazing how it's so poetic and comes together so well. And I'm very curious to see what Radcliffe has been doing in the time that since we acquired that work. He got his Bachelor of Fine Arts at the Atlanta College of Art, and you're seeing him in his studio in Atlanta right now. He has exhibited across the country. His works are in major museum collections around the country, over 40 at last count, obviously in the Hunters and the Mints, but also the Smithsonian, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Dallas Museum of Art, the Studio Museum Harlem, and the list goes just on and on. So we're so thrilled you're here again. And please put your questions and thoughts in the chat or the Q&A section, and we'll get to them as we can. So welcome, Radcliffe. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you for having me. All right. So how should I start? Do you want me? Okay. I guess I'll talk. Let's see. Let's go to the first image.
Okay.
Okay, cool. All right. So this piece is called Middle Passage, and it has a long story to it. It's an important piece to me. When I first started making work and I went to Atlanta College of Art, I had my first opportunity to show when I was in my junior year of college. There was a gallery that showed interest in my work, and I was introduced to the gallery, and I brought the work in after a pinup show. And this was a piece that I made around that time. And it was the first museum acquisition of my work. It was called Middle Passage. So I was just literally making this work just as I finished school. It's an image I was really dealing with like studying the history of Congolese. And I was really at that moment trying to understand my makeup as an artist, as an African-American artist, and trying to understand how the connection between the Atlantic. At the time, there was not like, I couldn't take a DNA test and trace it back. But at this moment when I was making this work, I was really studying different parts of West Africa that most African Americans come from. And that was my way of tracing the painting, sculpture. It's in between the two because at the time when I was making work, I was a sculpture major, but I was also in the painting department as well. The piece is made with a chain, with an axe on the end of the chain. And then there's 10 images of boats going up and down. And then there's kind of, in the beginning of me starting to use kind of like quilt forms and different shapes. And the paintings also, I made it with tar as well. And you can go to the next piece. I haven't seen that piece in a long time. It's nice to see it and it having a life. This piece is called Pulmonary, and it's based around Pullmans, in terms of like the railroad. Reason why the railroad comes up often in my work, because I'm tracing my family's history in terms of like they're being a part of the Underground Railroad. I'm from New Jersey originally, and I grew up in Atlanta. My parents moved to Atlanta when I was 4. My father's side of the family, they were a part of the Underground Railroad. And the other part that's a connection too is that my father was a railroad engineer, and he used to drive a train from Atlanta to Chattanooga. He would go and do a turnaround. he would go to Chattanooga and come back the next day. And it's always like trying to draw those relationships between the family members, and then also history, and trying to I've always been trying to layer my work and put one layer over top of another, try to be poetic in the way in which the layers kind of come together. I've always, at that time, of being very much influenced by hip hop music and the sampling and the collage and the way in which people put together fragments, considering the fact that sometimes we have to put together the past the best way we know how. You can go to the next slide. So this is in the Returnal. This was a piece that I did. I did it in 2006. And I did it right after I traced my mother's side in terms of her DNA, and I traced it to Sierra Leone and Guinea. And what I did was I took a trip to Senegal, because I wanted to go to some of the areas and some of the places that were a part of the slave trade, which, you know, like the door of no return, which a lot of African Americans families have come through those doors. So I went to do that, but I also collaborated with a musician named Mark Anthony Thompson, and then also a friend of mine named Fatima Robinson. We had similar DNA, and they were my friends, so I invited them to come, and we collaborated and we made work. This is not a part of the collaboration, but this was a piece that I did in response. And so when you look at the piece itself, there's a metal fence, and the metal fence that's there was taken from a graveyard site where my grandmother was buried, and other family members in New Jersey, and it was falling apart. So my father gave me and brought back the gate, and I incorporated it in the work. But I was always influenced by like blacksmiths and those that work in metal, like people like Philip Simmons and in the Carolinas, South Carolina. And then, you know, if you look at the piece too, in the background, there's a speedboat, and the speedboat, it twirls with a DNA strand. And that speedboat was really based around the thought of DNA at this moment and dealing with DNA. But it also deals with my family members that were also on my father's side that were Garveyites. And Marcus Garvey had a movement where he talked about going back to Africa. And so the idea of the speedboat was the fact that we can get there a lot faster. And I'm also, you know, fascinated with the fact that I feel like we live in two different world of things that are tangible and things that are not tangible. And some of that was based around some of the things that I studied in terms of the Yoruba from Nigeria, and some of their beliefs, and talking about other worlds. With the piece also, there's piano keys running through it, and the piano keys were really about the fact that the only form of DNA at the time that we had was relating to rhythms. And I've always felt like there are similar rhythms that people listen to, and they kind of bounce and go back and forth between the Atlantic. So like, take, for instance, there are people like Fela from Nigeria to James Brown in America, and how they kind of cross with each other and at the same time respected and understood each other's music. I'd be real curious to know what James Brown's DNA was in terms of that. And so what you do is see a piece that it divides in between two different worlds. And then on the piece itself is painted with Georgia clay. I live on Civil War grounds, and so basically I use like a lot of clay from my backyard. And the other parts are, you know, luggage and travel and music and shapes. And there's an old photograph, which was a part of a lot of my earlier work, which were photographs that were given to me by my grandmother before she passed. She gave me close to 400 photographs. And I began to use those within the work. So when I take away the photograph itself, sometimes it's like the work is not tangible. I mean, it's in a very abstract form, but the photograph is more a device to bring people along with me in my work. And you can see she's kind of wrapped with a shipping blanket. And I use a lot of materials that relate around shipping tarps, and just different objects that are really around shipping and movement, trains. This was another piece that I made these pieces at the same time. You can go back one. Okay, so I made these pieces at the same time, and this one's it's a frame around it, but it's actually I don't consider it a frame. These pieces are kind of like this, about 6 inches deep, and I consider them to be cabinets. And the idea of them is like whenever you're sick, somebody would go to a medicine cabinet and get something that would be good for them to heal them. And for me, memory was always a form of medicine for me. So the idea is like creating these cabinets that deal with memory. And throughout the cabinet itself in different areas, you'll see letters, and those letters are my DNA. You can go to the next slide. I'm gonna show some stuff a little bit different because I work in different materials and I change every once in a while. This was a piece that was commissioned by Fulton County in Atlanta, Georgia. This is a library that's on Auburn Avenue. Auburn Avenue was like where a lot of Black wealth was generated through. And so I was invited to do a piece based around Auburn Avenue, but also my own personal histories. And this one's called From the Cabinet. And From the Cabinet was based on Richard Long, who was a scholar that lived here in Atlanta, and a lot of his information is inside of the library itself. And so he wrote a poem for me that was called In the Cabinet before he passed. And so this piece was about that. And it's like you see the same kind of references to a DNA strand turning in steel. You go to the next slide. Okay, and so there are different shapes of ships and oars and books. And there's like a Mende mask from Sierra Leone, the shape of it, referencing my mother. My mother was a school teacher, so that was something that my mother was a person who really guided me towards art. So I like to reference her a lot within my work. And you can go to the next slide. This was a piece that was done. That was, on top of a shipping tarp. On top of the shipping tarp, you can't really see the details in this, but on top of the shipping tarp, I have sewed in the Mason-Dixon line, and I have the Mason-Dixon line. I have constellations and a lot of markings, and the boat itself swivels and points in the direction of the east whenever it's installed. So it pivots. Those are baskets of glass, and it was really a memory of going to the Pink Lake in Dakar, in Senegal. And I remember the sand and the glass. And so basically, I just created a piece that was with some of those thoughts. So sometimes I'm making work and it's not very specific. And there are moments that I'm just bringing in these different elements and these different thoughts. And it's kind of like, how can I say? I feel like I'm writing a book, and each painting is a page that deals with my life. And as much as I deal with history and things that were given to me and told to, I also deal with the times of today, but often it's not as visually, you don't catch it, but it's within the rhythm of my work. And I think even right now, and we're dealing with these times of the pandemics, and I'm dealing with that as well. And I'm dealing with it in a different way. And it's going to come out, within the work, no matter what. So you can go on to the next slide. This was a piece that was done based around King Leopold in Belgium. And it's called Congo, but it's based on rubber, and rubber was a thing in the Congo, and the Congolese were pretty much like made examples when they didn't do enough work. It was like they would do evil things like cut one of their limbs off, and so basically I took these religious fingers and arms and I put them within the piece on top of a rubber tarp. and, you know, to play with the rubber, and as well as like constellations of stars. You can go to the next one. This was based around the Great Mosque in Mali. And it was a piece that was at the same time I'm dealing with it and I'm learning about the histories and the making of mosque and understanding spirituality, but also, you know, it's a fascination with, let's see, living in between two worlds. It's like, there's a reference here to like the Georgia clay, the earth, but the earth is very similar in different parts of the world too. So what I have is more like, it's more like a, it's more like a, how can I say it? Well, basically the mud drips into the shell and it's called, the piece is called Echo. And so it's echoes of the past. And the image is actually printed on top of steel. The painting's made, I mean, the actual piece is made out of steel, clay, and shell. This was a painting that I just had a thought and I kept thinking about, you know, African art and how it winds up in different places and the powers of the African art itself and being crossing the Atlantic and, you know, the response as a kid. I remember going into a museum and seeing African art and how it influenced me. I remember at the same time going in and seeing African art, but also seeing the work of Bill Traylor on the wall. And those are, you know, he's one of my heroes with my work as well. And I began to use like this kind of cobalt blue. And then I'm also like, you know, there's another thing, I'm fascinated with the sea and how deep the sea goes, but then I'm also fascinated with outer space. And so it lies within between those worlds. So the water looks choppy. It looks like the moon is out. And it's just that kind of interesting kind of moment. Some of it references those that lost at sea and the practices and this, you know, those things that those Africans carried as crossing the Atlantic and coming to America in different parts, be it like in the islands and, you know, be it in Cuba, be it in Haiti, and some of those practices. You go, next slide. This piece is called Ness. Ness is made with piano keys and there's a falcon up top of it. And the falcon is, I use taxidermy at moments with my work, and that's a steel shelf. But Ness was really, it's interesting. I have a lot of falcons and hawks flying through my yard, so there's a reference to that. But there's also a reference to, hey, I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and I like the falcons and I like the hawks. So, next slide. You know, every once in a while, I put humor in my work. This piece itself, it was a commission that was commissioned by Amherst, and it was based on W.B. Du Bois. And W. Du Bois lived not far from where I made the piece. The piece was cast in bronze, and I've taken wood from that actual part of the country, and I incorporated that. But I wanted to make him as our version of the thinker, and he was such a serious guy that I couldn't really find humor sometimes in him. So I injected a little bit of humor. It's very, you know, Du Bois talks about a double consciousness, and as an African American, we constantly have our a mind in different spaces at the same time. And the piece is called Pensive. And you can go to the next slide. This piece is called On Your Way Up. And it's another use of taxidermy where I collected this crocodile from deaccession from a museum. It was from got it from an antique dealer from Belgium. And so I'm assuming that that may have been something that may have been part of the Royal Museum of Central Africa. I mean, the Royal Museum that's in Belgium. And so basically I incorporated with some of those thoughts, but I'm dealing with elders in my family. My grandfather on both sides of my family, which you'll see numbers, you see like on the left-hand side, you'll see AC, and then it'll have my grandfather's birth dates and when he died, and my other grandfather on the right-hand side. And it's a lot of stitching over top of it with different symbols that are from the Congo, but they also are symbols that you can see in southern parts of the United States. Some places in particular, like Savannah, Georgia, there's a church that's in Savannah, Georgia, which has like a Congo cosmogram that's in the bottom of the church, on the grounds of the church, up under the church. And basically it appeared as if that was something that was to cool the church, but those that were hiding away, that were escaping slavery, were hidden up under that church. And those were actually areas that were ventilation as well. This piece is called Levitate. Levitate, that's a boat. It's a very minimal piece. That's a boat that I brought back from Senegal. And I covered the boat and I created metal bars to make it float in front of the painting. So you can't really see the metal arm, but when you walk upon the piece, it appears as if it's floating in front of you. And just like the other ones, I'm using old shipping tarps and stitching on top of the canvases themselves. You can go to the next. This piece is called Lost and Found. Lost and Found, you basically see like a replica of a falcon, that Egyptian falcon that's on the left-hand side at the top. I mean, on the right-hand side at the top, but then there's also a jar. And the jar brings back memories, and it's interesting, like the times that we're living in now. And I don't know if you guys have known that the 17-year cicadas are about to come out. And I, as a kid, was caught in one of those cicada storms when I went to visit my grandparents in Virginia. And I would spend summers in right outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, in a town called Palmyra. And I'm referencing that. There's a family photo album that's dipped in Georgia clay that sits on the inside of it. There's a hand holding up a slide of an image of Saturn. And I think I have another image of this from a different angle. Let me see, you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so it's like a glass that sits in front of it. And on the glass itself is it's mirror tint. And the mirror tint is meant to be like reflection, so you can kind of see yourself within the pieces as well. But it's also, I'm dealing with like interest in like things from Congo, that there are some objects that have glass within front of them, and those are meant to repel as well. This piece is called Rocking. And rocking, it's back to a little bit of humor, but it's also dealing with travel in the past. There are different places around the world that are written across the painting itself with there's names from all different parts of the world. There might be like names of like Bristol. And why Bristol? Because that's where slave ships were made. There's also references to Haiti, but there's also, it's a piece about me dancing over top of my paintings while listening to James Brown and listening to Bob Marley. Bob Marley has a song called Rockin'. And then there's also like Michael Jackson is in it, Rock With Me. So it's a playful piece, but it's serious as well. And the rock itself was taken from my grandparents' property in Virginia. And I like to incorporate different things, rocks and dirt, earth. Sometimes I'll go to a place like off the coast somewhere, be it like off the coast of Savannah, and I'll collect water. I'll collect the water, I'll take the water, but I'll mix the water within my acrylics. And so that's the way in which I'm kind of operating in a different way. And I would like to think of myself as, problem solving towards something that may have happened around the time that I was actually making the work itself. And so you can kind of see footprints across the piece. I'm just really working on top of the piece. Oh man, this is a piece that I really enjoyed making. It's actually I work with carpenters, and I work with an old carpenter, and basically this was like it was a music stand, but I replicate the music stand so that it can extend 12 feet high. The music stand was made, and then I wanted to have more like a bird cage. I had a piece that I made before where I use African finches, and I put them in a bird cage, and I basically had a recording of Charlie Parker's music playing, and the birds would chirp, and it was almost like a concert between Charlie Parker and the birds. But in the bird cage, which is not on this one, in the bird cage, I had sheet music up under the tray. And so when the birds would poop, they would poop on top of the sheet music. And that I would call bird shit. And the reason why I called it bird shit, because I was just thinking of all the stuff that he had to deal with. And I was just really, injecting humor as well. This one, I collected instruments from New Orleans. I got the instruments from one of the places where they teach music in New Orleans. And I think it was the Ninth Ward. I can't remember exactly, but it's where the Marcelluses have like a music village. And I collect damaged instruments from Katrina, and I incorporated them in the piece. This was a piece that was commissioned by the Gordon Parks Foundation. I've always been influenced by Gordon Parks and his work. I learned a lot about history and things that I didn't know about that happened that my parents went through his work. I ended up marrying his daughter. That's one thing. And based around that, my relationship with the foundation is a special one. And they commissioned me to do this. And this was a photograph that was done by Gordon Parks. And it was a piece that he was doing with Richard Bright. And so, yeah, so this piece was, it's a dimensional piece. If you see the photograph is a photograph that was staged. And I basically recreated the stage itself with 2 record players and a chair and lights. And you can kind of see the backdrop of the city in the photograph. So, but you can go to the next slide. This piece is called Tricky. And Tricky is what you see, I refer to Tricky and I refer to Eshu. Legba goes by different names, but would be pretty much like the guardian of the crossroads. And that's what you see is like a canvas that's wrapped around the back that just draped over top, almost like the shoulders. And there's a rock, and the rock itself is wrapped with metal. And basically the metal that is wrapped around, I was looking at the way blacksmiths make things, and I started making things that were in reference to like that's from a reference from an old slave collar, which were put around those that were escaping and unruly and those that were escaping. So there's a reference to a lot of different things with the piece and the top hat. And yeah. This is a photograph in my studio. A couple years ago, I was commissioned by the Atlanta Falcons, the new stadium in Atlanta, Mercedes-Benz, and I was commissioned to do a piece, and I wanted to do a piece that was dealing with historically Black colleges and the football teams and the individuals who played on the football teams. And some of those individuals, like, in some of these images, I have images of Charles Drew and dealing with transfusion of blood. And so, great people who did great things, but he was like a coach. And so you can kind of there's a lot of references. Some of it's references to earlier paintings of mine, quilt making, but it was also like the HBCUs, because right across from the stadium is the historically Black colleges: Morehouse, Spelman, Clark, Atlanta University, Morris Brown, and those schools were all within one area. And I wanted to do something in remembrance of those athletes, and as well as the African American players that play on the professional leagues now. So those are a lot of thoughts that were going in my mind. The piece is probably, I think it's about maybe 70 feet by, I don't know, 20. You can go to the next slide. So you can kind of get a sense of scale. And railroad tracks run through. That's a constant. And those in the right-hand corner, those are images of African Americans at a Howard University football game. And yeah, and then the one in the middle is Lincoln University. And the one at the top left is Atlanta University. And so, yes, you can kind of get a sense of how big it is right now. But yeah, you can go to the next slide. That's cool. This piece is called Caravan, and it was a photograph that I collected, and it was a photograph of 4 guys, and it appears as if they were celebrating, or they could have been at a funeral. The reason why I say that is because I look at the black marking on the guy on the right-hand side. I like to read photographs and try to read through the past, because sometimes you have these old photographs and you see them, but they end up in antique shops, or sometimes they're discarded because nobody knows anything about them. But the photographs, I just like the way in which they were carrying themselves at that time period, because I'm assuming this is probably around the 20s. And inside the cabinet, you have like a railroad track that runs throughout it that's made in steel. On the bottom, there's a boat that was made from matchsticks. And the matchsticks were boats that were made, people would make things in matchsticks in prisons. They were making things from objects. And if I read the object right, I mean, the actual object, I would assume that it was from prisons. And so it's a combination of a lot of thoughts about the piece. It's a big cabinet. It's about maybe, the piece itself is about, I want to say 12 feet tall. It's about 12 feet by 5. This was a piece that was made, it was made right after, these strange times right now with people with these crazy shootings and stuff. This one I made the piece around the time of the incident in Charleston. And so I have the palm that runs across it, but I also have railroad tracks that are going in different directions. And the railroad tracks are like this blood red, and it was dealing with blood and sacrifice. And it was, I deal with subject matters like that in a different way. I talk about them, but I use beauty as a device to bring people along in the conversation. This is one based around the North Star. This is like, this is about, the piece itself is 20 feet by 20 feet. And tracks made in steel. At the top right-hand corner, you can barely, top right side, you can see like a blue light. That blue light is a neon light of the North Star. So basically it's a neon light of the letter N, but it's also referencing the North Star. And it's, it's a cross in between it and dealing with crossing and crossroads and directions. And the arrow on the left-hand side goes counterclockwise, and that deals with Congo cosmograms. And you can go next slide. This piece was a piece that was commissioned to me back in 2016. It was commissioned to me by Prospect. in New Orleans. The piece itself was, I wanted to make a piece that it's called Vessel. I wanted to make a piece that was dealing with a couple things. One was the location. I was right there, right by the Mississippi, and I was right, I could see ships going by. I could see downtown New Orleans, and on one side of it, right behind the trees, there was a railroad track that was literally like 30, 40 feet away. So basically there's when you go into the piece, there's a conch shell that's in the middle. And when you walk inside, there's a stereo system. You can't see it, but there's a stereo system that wraps around the piece. And it's hitting behind the steel, but built within the steel. So it's one solid shape. And there's a speaker coming out of the conch shell. And so when you come in, you hear the sounds of trains. And then you hear the sounds of a friend of mine. I had him, he plays the cello, and I had him basically come over at my house on a full moon, and I burnt a fire into my backyard. And so basically you hear the popping of the fire, and you can hear the insects, you can hear cicadas, you can hear dogs barking in the background, you can hear the sounds of trains, and also it's mixed together with the sounds of the ocean. And the piece itself, it's called Vessel. And it's meant to look like a stack on a ship. Yeah, so the conch shell, before that piece, I did a piece with a conch shell with sound. And this piece is as it sounds of, you can, I'm gonna tell you as you go, but in the next slide, you can go to the next slide. The next slide is, you can see the piano keys. And the piano keys, I collected over 400 sets of piano keys. I still have piano keys that I collected from a old piano shop, and they were going out of business. And I remember going into the piano shop with pianos stacked on top of pianos. And I remember them discarding the piano keys, and some of the piano keys had ivory, they had ebony ivory, and they were just beautiful. And I began to collect them, and when I collect them, I bring them to my studio and I just drop them on the floor, and I immediately realized that was the piece itself. But this piece is called Windward Coast. Part of it is dealing with, like earlier I was talking about the music and how music is like a form of DNA. So it's really about tracing that. And it's also, if you think about it, the history of all the music that's come throughout those piano keys. And then I'm also thinking about, a great music that was created in America, and which is jazz music, and the way in which that music does its own thing, and it can be forms of other things, but those musicians turned it into something truly unique. And so I imagine Thelonious Monk is one of my favorite musicians. It refers to those that were lost at sea during the Middle Passage. It also relates to me you can go to the next slide. It also relates to me going fishing with my father and going so far out in the sea and feeling so small once you're out in the sea. The bus right there is kind of like a bus that I've used in other works, and it's from like a death mask, and it was really taking molds and body shapes of people at that time. And that death mask, which is one that I've collected through an antique shop, and it's covered with black sand, and it's meant to be about that. It kind of relates to the piece that you guys have in your collection. And it's also one that I kind of come back to. The piece itself, I had to exhibit it in different parts of the world that I've always wanted to be a part, where I wanted the work to be itself. So the piece has traveled in a strange way, and it's touched the ground in strange places, but places that were a part of the slave trade. Like take, for instance, it went to Cartagena and to Colombia. It went to Dakar. And it also it was in New Orleans. And so the references to that could be Katrina. There's a bunch of different things that it's funny how when you make work and it just does its own thing and it speaks to people in different ways. And you can go to the next slide. So it's back to that shell. So in the shell in the corner of the piece, which what I did was I create these sound pieces, and pretty much as I'm installing the work and I'm rolling around the carts and stuff like that, I put a recorder and start recording myself. But at the same time, I have earphones on and I'm listening to John Coltrane. But at the same time, while I'm doing that, the recorder is recording me working. And it's not recording the John Coltrane, but it's recording me dropping the keys. So basically what you can hear is the stacking of the piano keys dropping. And it's just, it gives a different sound. It almost sounds like a wave when it comes out of the conch shell. And you can go to the next slide. This was a recent piece that I was commissioned by the Istanbul Biennale. And it was a piece that is called Nomo. And the piece was, I constructed and I made it in Istanbul. And it's meant to be like the bottom of a ship. And you walk around the piece. This is why I'm actually creating the piece. And I collected wood from buildings that were being built in Istanbul. And it was a very free-flowing piece. You can go to the next slide. And so when you walk through the piece, I use the bus. And the bus, I carry the bus with me often, and he's become a part of my work, where he comes out like in some parts of my work, I should use certain things over and over. Well, some things become more like deities and representatives of deities. And so what you see in the piece itself, there's a radio in the background, and the radio itself was, it's an antenna that's on top of the radio that turns into a pyramid. The piece is based around one of my favorite jazz musicians, which is Sun Ra. Sun Ra talked about being from outer space and being from Saturn, and actually being from Saturn. And so there's that reference to that. But there was a time period when Sun Ra played in Istanbul, and he played on the back of an 18-wheeler driving through the cities of Istanbul, and the band played on top of it. And it just, at the time when I went to do a visit to Istanbul, I pulled that thought, and the piece itself was meant to be the bottom of a ship. But it was also meant to be about Sun Ra. So basically you have music that is coming out the radio, which is a collage of different sounds, but Sun Ra's music is over top of it. And so, and it goes by, like, I think the song is, you can hear one of the singers in Sun Ra's group named June Tyson. She talks about, if you find Earth boring, just the same old same thing, sign up for Outer Spaceways Incorporated. And it really talks about like Sun Ra and the ideal movement and ships. And when I think about Sun Ra, I also think about like Marcus Garvey and traveling, movement. But Sun Ra was talking about traveling to other realms. Okay. And this was a piece, it's based around the door of no return in Senegal, in Dakar. And the door of no return basically was like a slave castle, but there was a door that led out to the ocean. And that was the last time that Africans had touched home and were on the ships to crossing the Atlantic. And it's meant to be like, the screen itself is meant to look like outer space. And it's got a glittery surface. And it's, as much as it looks dark, it also is really about outer space. The photograph itself is a photograph of the ocean that I took an image of when I was in Dakar. And then also another part of the work that is not in, that I'm working on too, is that I've done video footage where I basically rented a fishing boat in Dakar. And there's these very bright, colorful boats that they make for the fishermen. And I rented one, and what I did was basically drove back and forth. So it appears as if I was coming back through the door entrance and leaving the door entrance. And I think that's the last slide. I mean, if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Radcliffe. That was so interesting. I could listen to you talk for a lot longer than that.
Yeah.
We do have a few questions. A lot of them relate to process. Can you talk a little more about how you work? Do you choose objects first? Do you have an idea first? Do you sketch? How do you approach something?
I don't know. That's a weird one. Being an artist, we have opportunity to touch all different types of materials. I think a lot of it's really about putting your personal experience within it. I think that for me, it was more about like, I like going to antique shops. Reason why I like going to antique shops because I can step a foot in the past, and I can think about those objects and the patina that's left on those objects. So often I'm gathering objects. I go to big antique fairs and I'm always looking for something new. I want to go to Chattanooga. I want to search for some objects there too. So my eyes are always open for those objects, and I let the objects kind of create their own meaning sometimes, let them speak for themselves. But I'm also like, I don't say I do research,
Mhm.
but I do a little research. And I think it's the reason why I dig as deep as I can in my own personal histories and families and relationships with that in order to put it out there in a way. And I feel like, I've finally come to a point of feeling comfortable with the work that I make. I'm always insecure about the work I make. And I think that that's a good thing to have. I think that making the work is really about problem solving. It's almost like I'm playing chess with myself. And I'm putting colors together that don't work together, and I'm trying to make them work. And so I create a problem to solve as opposed to knowing the easiest way to get there. I try not to repeat myself, but I'm still telling my same story, but I'm just changing. I'm going to the next page and the next page. The pieces, I guess you can kind of see stuff in the background.
We can.
Yeah, like those are like cabinets that I'm doing, and they're in the beginning stage. There may be photographs that are incorporated in. On the back corner over here, you can see right there with the shelf, and there's looks like a concrete block, and the concrete block is like tabby, and I'm basically referencing tabby as a material. And tabby, if anybody doesn't know about tabby, that's like a material that I remember seeing it when I would go throughout the Carolinas, or I think in just places that are close to the coast. And basically tabby was used as a material, and that was brought over from Africa. And I think more so specifically, I want to say like North Africa. I want to say like, there's a Spanish connection, but it's also like this material that was used to make houses. Mm-hmm. And you would see it on plantations. And so I've really been like researching like architecture on different plantations, and fascinated with going and living through histories and understanding things that are still left there that are becoming invisible. So you can kind of see a connection between all those different objects. And so I collect those things, I bounce around. I work on paper. Right now I'm doing a lot of welding. Mm-hmm. I have a show that comes up in New York in November, so I'm kind of getting ready for that. One other thing is like my heads right now, I'm working on public sculpture. So I'm doing stuff in outdoor spaces where I'm creating things like amphitheaters, and I'm making a sculpture now that's in Greensboro, and it's of a railroad track that runs 30 feet high in the sky. And I'm working with landscape architects. So it's a combination of a lot of things. And those are things that are influencing me right now.
So I love what you said about how you're going from one page to another, and you're telling your story through all these different formats. It sounds very intuitive in a way, although I can see that there's a lot of internal and external research that happens.
Right.
You started out as a painter, I think, to some degree, and always a collage artist, and moving into assemblage. Do you still incorporate painting into your work?
Yeah, I mean, painting's always like, yes, painting always comes in. I ever since I started working in different materials, I've never really abandoned any material. I kind of carry it along with me no matter what. I just choose to do it at certain moments. And a lot of artists work a lot of different ways. Some artists work the same way. I just, because of coming from like a sculptural background, it's almost like that's always going to become a part of the work no matter what. Even if it's something that's flat, it's like saying the earth was, flat, and then I basically, if I paint on top of something, I'm making this object, and it has dimensions that they're not just flat, so I'm just trying to also take away a Western way of thinking from it too. I'm trying to break down, I'm trying to reteach myself certain things. I'm looking at different things. So yes, I still paint. And I paint a lot, but sometimes there's moments when I just don't feel like painting. But yeah.
So we had a couple of very specific questions, and then one bigger one, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
That piece we had that you showed, it was a steel plate with a conch shell. It had a photograph on it, and a conch shell dripping the Georgia clay down onto
Right.
the ground. Does that continually drip? Or is it just
No,
like one time? Okay.
no, I have a way in which what I do is it's at Wellesley, and it became a part of a collection. I had a traveling show that went there, and so basically whenever it's reinstalled, I have different directions in terms of how to do it. They actually still have earth. And so whenever they want to take it down and put it up, there's a way in which they can do it. So the piece has its life of its own. But no, it's dry.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the train tracks that you have in so many of your pieces, are those found objects that I realize they're not actual train tracks, but are they found objects made to look like tracks? Or are you creating them out of metal that you're welding? How are you creating those pieces?
Right. I'm making all those myself, making those in metal. And, I just kind of created, every once in a while, I create a new way of doing things. And that was like me taking something that I've been painting for a minute, and I said, okay, well, I might as well make it in steel. And I'm making a lot of stuff right now in steel, where there are sculptural pieces that are kind of like in the same size of like the first piece that you showed, the first piece that I'd ever sold into a museum collection. And it's pretty much like I'm working in that scale, but that scale with just steel and found objects, and the track becomes more like a net to hold objects.
Okay, very interesting. So we've had a couple of questions about how you feel about confronting race with your work, because it certainly talks about issues related to the slave trade and finding your personal history, especially your own. But I think we can all extrapolate it to be a little bit universal when we think about migration and immigration. But how do you feel in today's kind of climate about how your work speaks to people today?
I never really think about it. But, the one thing that I hope we don't repeat is the past. And sometimes I feel like when I began making my work, it was really about a conversation that I was having with my kids. And it felt as if I was sharing thoughts and things that I've heard and things that have been passed down to me in terms of stories. And it felt as if I was just sharing information. It's interesting. I mean, that's an interesting question, because for me, as much as it is about dealing with the topics and the things that we deal with today, there's also 70% of it that's really based around making things that are beautiful. I'm trying to make things that are beautiful. I'm trying to make lemonade out of lemon. And I'm just trying my best to deal with it. And there are moments that I deal with the pains and the things that we're dealing with. I just feel like there's a way to confront it with spirituality. And I'm not really like political. I never really kind of consider myself as an artist that made political statements. I always felt like I'm really just trying to trace history and understand my presence and talk about my experiences as an American. I had family members that fought in Civil War. I've had family members that fought in Revolutionary War. I've had like a lot of history running through my family, be it those that were escaping during the Underground Railroad and trying to get to Canada. And I feel like, it's there, but I'm really just putting down information before it disappears. And I feel like in the times that we live in right now, we do have access to a lot of stuff, the internet. But often when it comes to younger people, not really having access to older people the same way. So that's kind of what I'm doing. I think I'm trying to do what my grandfather did, but he did it in a very silent way, was that he would make birdhouses and he would tell me stories how the birds will tell you when the weather changes, but he would say, and people will too. And I'm just trying, I guess I feel like I'm speaking in that same tongue, that I'm just trying to bring those connections.
Mhm.
As well as I'm a contemporary artist, but I'm also dealing in a certain time period. And sometimes it feels as if when people see some parts of my work, they think that I'm speaking in a different time, but I'm speaking in today's times. I'll take something negative and I'll go into my studio, which I kind of consider my church, because I'm not a religious person. But when I go in the studio's church.
Mhm.
I spit out all my pains and my problems, and I put it into my work. And it's usually like at the last minute it comes together, and then I feel as if I've done what I needed to do, and I have gotten that off of my shoulders. I've wished upon things. Sometimes I like to see myself as a practitioner. Often, as a caring, loving, giving person who wants to care and love and give for the whole world.
Well, your
But yeah,
works really have a way of speaking both to our history and to our present. So I really
thank you.
I appreciate you joining us, and thank you so much for your time, Radcliffe. It was if you look in the Q&A and chat sections on your screen, you will see all the lovely comments. But thank you all for joining us again from the Hunter Museum for Artwise. If you haven't had a chance to see Under Construction Collage from the Mint Museum, please come see it. It is up for 3 more weeks, and we have a few more programs related to the exhibition. Check them out at huntermuseum.org. Thank you all.
Thank you.